Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. What begins with a seemingly innocent family heirloom, a candlestick, quickly spirals into a web of deception, dark secrets, and an unsolved murder that has been buried for generations. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, the candlestick that shouldn't be there. The rain drummed softly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, the rhythmic patter a constant companion to the fire crackling lazily in the hearth. Inside the dimly lit room, Sherlock Holmes sat, his sharp eyes scanning the cluttered desk in front of him, where a variety of maps, books, and half-finished case notes lay. His fingers, long and delicate, tapped lightly on the arm of his chair, a gesture that betrayed the depth of his thought. Watson, seated nearby with a pen in hand, was absorbed in his own work, writing the latest account of their most recent adventure. Holmes, however, seemed far removed from the present, his gaze distant, as if he were already lost in the labyrinth of his thoughts. The silence between them was comfortable, yet there was a weight to it, the kind that only came when Holmes was deep in contemplation. It had been several days since their last case, and the lack of a challenge seemed to gnaw at him, as though his mind craved a puzzle, a conundrum that would demand every ounce of his intellect. The sudden sound of a doorbell ringing sharply cut through the stillness, and Holmes's posture shifted instinctively, his fingers pausing mid-tap. He straightened, his eyes flickering towards the door. "That," he murmured, more to himself than to Watson, "is the sound of opportunity." Watson looked up, a mild surprise in his eyes, though he had grown accustomed to Holmes's peculiar ways. He placed his pen down with a deliberate motion, his curiosity piqued. "Opportunity, what is it this time, Holmes?" Watson asked, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he rose from his chair, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure in the dim room. He moved with purposeful grace, his dark coat sweeping behind him as he crossed the room in a few swift strides. At the door he paused briefly, listening intently. There was the sound of hurried footsteps outside, and then the door opened, revealing a young woman. She was visibly distressed, her wide eyes darting anxiously around the room, as though she feared someone might be watching from the shadows. Her attire, though elegant, was slightly dishevelled, her hair undone, a few stray curls falling from their pins. In her hands she clutched a small leather bag, which she held tightly to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Holmes studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing but not unkind. He gestured to the chair opposite his voice calm and inviting. "Please, sit," he said, his tone cool but not dismissive. "You have come to the right place." The woman hesitated for a brief second before stepping into the room, her footsteps soft on the polished wood floor. She moved cautiously, as if every inch of the space held some unspoken danger. Once seated, she placed the leather bag beside her, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Her gaze shifted to Holmes, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice quivering but steady enough to convey urgency. "Let me guess," Holmes interrupted, his voice almost teasing. "You are in desperate need of assistance, and you have come to seek the expertise of the great detective Sherlock Holmes." The woman's lips parted in surprise, but she quickly regained composure, nodding once. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I need your help with something that has been troubling me and my family for days." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in interest. He had a way of making people feel as though they were the only ones in the room, as if he had the power to peel away the layers of their minds without them even noticing. "What is it that troubles you, madam?" he asked, his tone now less playful and more focused. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though weighing her words carefully. "It's a candlestick," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A simple object, but it has caused strange things to happen in my family's home, things that I cannot explain." Holmes tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "A candlestick, you say?" His fingers twitched ever so slightly, a small sign of his growing interest. What is it about this particular candlestick that has caused such concern?" The woman's eyes flickered to the leather bag beside her, as though it contained some hidden secret she was reluctant to reveal. She hesitated for a moment longer before answering. "It was moved," she said simply, her voice betraying a trace of fear. "It's always been placed on the mantel, a family heirloom of sorts, but now it's gone. And ever since it was moved, strange things have been happening, things that cannot be explained." Holmes sat back, his fingers steepled together, his mind already whirring as he began to form a theory. His eyes never left the woman's face, studying her every expression, every flicker of emotion that passed through her. She was clearly frightened, but there was something more, a hidden depth to her words, a weight in her tone that hinted at something far more sinister than an ordinary family disturbance. "I see," Holmes said slowly, his voice taking on a quieter, more contemplative quality. "Tell me, madam, when did you first notice that something was amiss?" The woman swallowed hard before answering, her voice tinged with both fear and confusion. "It started when my father's health began to decline, suddenly, and then my brother, he disappeared for days, only to return with no memory of where he had been." Her hands tightened around the bag once more, her knuckles white. "And now, the candlestick, it's missing. It shouldn't be gone, Mr. Holmes. It's as though someone has taken it. But why? And what is it that's happening to my family?" Holmes' expression grew more serious as the weight of her words settled in. The case, though mysterious, was only beginning to unfold, but already it seemed far more complex than he had anticipated. A single object, seemingly trivial, had set off a chain of events that threatened to unravel the very fabric of this family's life. "You have come to the right place," Holmes said again, his voice low but certain. "Rest assured, madam, I will get to the bottom of this. The truth always reveals itself one way or another." As the woman gave a small, relieved nod, Holmes stood and moved towards the window, his gaze sweeping over the fog-covered city streets below. The mystery, he knew, was already much deeper than it appeared. And somewhere hidden in the darkened corners of this estate, the answers waited to be uncovered. The next morning, Holmes and Watson found themselves on the train to the countryside, the rhythmic chugging of the engine a quiet accompaniment to their thoughts. Holmes, ever the enigma, sat with his eyes closed, his mind clearly preoccupied with the case at hand. Watson, on the other hand, was gazing out the window at the passing landscape, trying to piece together what little information they had gleaned from the previous evening. The woman, whose name as it turned out was Lady Eleanor Everleigh, had left an impression on Holmes, but it was the air of mystery that clung to the family estate, like the fog that surrounded it, that intrigued him most. There was more to this than a missing candlestick. The way Eleanor had spoken about the decline of her father's health and her brother's strange disappearance suggested a deeper, darker undercurrent. The train screeched to a halt, and the two men disembarked, greeted by the sharp chill of early morning air. The Everleigh estate, as they had been warned, lay just beyond a winding path, shrouded in the mist of the morning. As they approached the estate, the imposing silhouette of the mansion loomed in the distance, its windows dark and forbidding. Lady Eleanor was waiting for them by the front door. Her expression was one of strained composure, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her anxiety. She greeted Holmes and Watson with a polite nod, but there was an underlying tension in her demeanor, as if she were not entirely at ease with their presence. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice softer than it had been the night before. "I know this must seem trivial, but I truly fear for my family's well-being." Holmes regarded her with his usual calm, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of deception. "Do not concern yourself, Lady Eleanor. I assure you nothing is trivial when it comes to the safety of one's family. We will uncover the truth in due time." The house seemed to whisper secrets of its own as they entered, the wooden floors creaking underfoot, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. The Everleigh family home had an eerie stillness to it, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they walked through the hallways, Holmes noted the rich furnishings and faded portraits on the walls, framed images of ancestors who seemed to watch them with knowing eyes. But it wasn't the opulence of the surroundings that caught his attention. It was the unease that seemed to cling to every corner of the house, like the shadows themselves were unwilling to leave. Lady Eleanor led them to the drawing-room, where her father, Lord Everleigh, sat in a large high-backed chair by the fire. He was an older man, his features sharp and distinguished, though his health clearly seemed to have deteriorated. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were pale and slightly trembling, though he did not acknowledge it. His eyes, however, were sharp, and they followed Holmes with a wary intensity. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "I trust my daughter has explained the situation. I will not deny that there is something unsettling about what has been happening in this house, but I do not believe that a missing candlestick should be of such concern." Holmes studied Lord Everleigh for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. The old man's tone was dismissive, but there was something in his posture, a subtle tension in the way he held himself, that told Holmes that he was more aware of the gravity of the situation than he let on. "I am sure there is much more to this than simply a missing object," Holmes replied coolly. "You do not seem the type to ignore such matters lightly, my lord." Lord Everleigh's gaze flickered for just a moment, a brief hesitation that was quickly masked by a thin smile. "I have lived a long life, Mr. Holmes, and in that time I've learned that some things are better left unexplained, but I am not one to stand in the way of your inquiry." As Holmes continued to observe him, Watson felt a growing sense of unease. There was something about Lord Everleigh's words that felt too carefully measured, too rehearsed, and there was a subtle defensiveness in his posture that didn't quite match the confidence of his tone. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, as if he had already reached some conclusion, though he said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to the room around him. The drawing-room was large and comfortably furnished, but there was an odd feeling of being watched, as if the room itself were filled with unseen eyes. The portrait above the fireplace, a dark-haired woman with a stern, unblinking gaze, seemed to stare directly at Holmes, and he could not help but wonder if it was a portrait of Eleanor's mother, the woman who had passed away several years ago. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," Holmes began, turning his gaze back to her, "has anything unusual happened in this room? Any strange noises, or perhaps an unusual change in atmosphere?" Eleanor stiffened slightly at the question, her eyes darting briefly to the portrait on the wall. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a soft, hurried footstep echoed from the hallway outside. A figure appeared in the doorway, a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark, tousled hair and a nervous energy about him. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were looking for an escape. "Ah, my son," Lord Everleigh said, his voice cold but not unkind. "This is our family's last remaining hope, the infamous detective Sherlock Holmes." The young man stepped into the room slowly, his hands clenched at his sides as though trying to steady himself. He looked at Holmes with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, but there was something else in his eyes, an apprehension that seemed to hang over him like a cloud. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rough, "I am Richard Everleigh. I'm afraid I don't quite understand what is going on, but I am willing to cooperate." Holmes gave a brief nod, his gaze lingering on Richard's tense posture. "That is all I ask, Mr. Everleigh. You have no need to explain yourself yet. I will, however, ask you all to remain patient. It is only by gathering the pieces of the puzzle that we will begin to see the true picture." Lady Eleanor and Lord Everleigh exchanged glances, and Holmes observed the subtle exchange with interest. There was something unsaid between them, a tension that was almost palpable. It seemed that the Everleigh family was a house divided, not just by their own fears, but by a deeper, unspoken divide that had been festering for years. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Holmes continued, his tone suddenly all business, "I shall examine the candlestick's resting place and the surrounding area. There may be more to this than a simple piece of silverware gone missing." As the family quietly nodded, Holmes rose from his chair and the investigation began in earnest. The room was quieter than before, the murmur of voices still hanging in the air as Holmes led the family to the heart of the mystery. The drawing room, despite its grandeur, now seemed heavy, its high ceilings and elegant furnishings unable to dispel the unsettling atmosphere that had begun to settle over the estate. Holmes took a moment to glance at the room's centerpiece, the fireplace, where the candlestick had once sat. Lady Eleanor had explained the placement of the object earlier, its positioning always precise and deliberate. Now, where the mantle should have been adorned with its familiar weight, there was an unsettling emptiness. The absence was not merely physical. It was as if the space itself had been robbed of something integral, something that had once tied the room together. Holmes stood silently in front of the mantel for a long moment, his eyes scanning the area with quiet intensity. His gaze swept over the immaculate woodwork of the mantelpiece, taking in every detail: the absence of dust, the faint outline of where the candlestick had once rested, and the faint discoloration of the wood that betrayed where the object had been. His fingers hovered over the surface, as if testing for some residue that had yet to be erased. "This is odd," Holmes muttered to himself, his voice soft but intent. "Very odd indeed." Lady Eleanor, standing just behind him, looked anxiously from the empty spot on the mantel to Holmes, then to her father, who had remained seated by the fire, watching the proceedings with a detached expression. It was clear that the old man was not as concerned as his daughter, though something in his demeanour suggested a reluctance to discuss the matter further. Holmes, however, was not deterred by the silence. He continued his inspection, noting the subtle details that most would have missed. A single thread, dark and brittle, clung to the corner of the mantel, just out of place against the otherwise polished wood. It looked as though it had been hastily removed, as if someone had been in a hurry to tidy up the scene. Turning to face Lady Eleanor, Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Has anyone been in this room recently besides yourself and your family, Lady Eleanor?" Her eyes shifted nervously, her gaze flickering briefly to her father before she answered, "No, Mr. Holmes, no one. At least, not that I know of." Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line as he considered her response. It was rare that someone would lie so plainly, but the instinctive avoidance in her eyes hinted at something she was not yet willing to reveal. Still, he let the matter lie for the moment, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, until Holmes finally broke it with a soft exhale. "And what of your brother, Mr. Richard? Has he been in this room recently?" Eleanor hesitated before answering, her eyes flicking once more to Richard, who had been standing by the window, staring out at the garden with a faraway look in his eyes. He had not yet spoken, his presence in the room almost unnoticed, as though he were merely an observer rather than an active participant. I don't know," Eleanor replied, her voice faltering. "He's been in and out of his rooms, but I haven't seen him here." Holmes turned his gaze back to the empty spot on the mantel, his mind already spinning with possibilities. He had not yet gathered enough information, but he could sense the growing web of deceit and confusion that was beginning to form. There was more to the missing candlestick than met the eye, that much was certain, and the key to unravelling the mystery lay in the hidden corners of this house, within the secrets that each member of the family was so desperately trying to conceal. Holmes stood back from the mantel, his eyes scanning the entire room once more, as if trying to read the very atmosphere of the place. It was then that he noticed something else, something that had escaped his initial scrutiny. Beneath the foot of the grand piano, just a few feet from where he stood, there was an object partially obscured by the heavy curtains that draped the windows. It was small, but its shape caught his eye. Without a word, Holmes moved swiftly across the room, his long strides taking him to the corner of the room. He reached down and pulled the curtains back, revealing a small, ornate box, its dark wood surface polished to a rich sheen. It was delicate, far too small to belong to the typical furnishings of the estate. Holmes's fingers hovered over the box, and as he touched it, a sharp, acrid smell suddenly filled the air. The scent of something metallic, almost like the tang of blood, made his nose wrinkle. He lifted the box carefully, his brow furrowing as he inspected it more closely. It was locked, but the craftsmanship of the lock seemed familiar. Turning it over in his hands, Holmes' eyes narrowed as he spotted a peculiar engraving on the bottom, an emblem he recognized immediately. It was the insignia of the Everleigh family, a symbol that had once been used in a secretive and now forgotten branch of the family's history. The emblem was barely visible, faded from years of neglect. "This," Holmes murmured, his voice more to himself than to the others, "is no mere trinket." Eleanor, who had been standing anxiously at the edge of the room, stepped forward at the sound of his voice. "What is it, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he carefully placed the box on the table in front of him and studied it, as though weighing his next move. There were so many questions yet unanswered, but the discovery of this small box had the unmistakable scent of something far darker than a mere missing candlestick. Turning his gaze back to Eleanor, Holmes spoke slowly. "Lady Eleanor, it seems that there is more to your family's history than I had initially anticipated, and it is becoming quite clear that this case is far from trivial." Her eyes widened, and for the first time she seemed truly unsettled. "Mr. Holmes?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight, enigmatic smile. "I believe," he said, his tone cold and calculated, "we are on the cusp of something much more dangerous than you realize." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his mind whirring with new possibilities as he considered the box before him. The lingering scent of metal and old wood filled the air, blending with the musty undertones of the room. Lady Eleanor, still standing near the window, shifted nervously, her hands wringing together as if she wished to speak but was unsure of the right words. Lord Everleigh, from his seat by the fire, did nothing to alleviate the silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands steepled before him as though deep in thought, or perhaps avoiding something he did not want to confront. "That emblem," Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate, "it is of a branch of your family that has long been forgotten, Lady Eleanor, a branch that once was shrouded in secrecy and perhaps even shame." Eleanor stiffened at the mention of the emblem, and for a fleeting moment Holmes thought he caught a hint of fear in her eyes. I don't know what you mean," she replied quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "That emblem, I've never seen it before." Holmes did not respond immediately, instead letting her words hang in the air like a challenge. His eyes were still fixed on the box in front of him, but his mind was racing. What had once been hidden away in this family's history was now coming to the surface, unwillingly, perhaps, but unmistakably. He carefully turned the box over, feeling the smoothness of its polished surface beneath his fingertips. Its lock was delicate, intricately crafted, yet it held no key, no immediate way to uncover its secrets. "Has this box been in the house long, Lady Eleanor?" Holmes asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. She shook her head slowly, her eyes averted as though the question had struck too close to a tender memory. "No, I've never seen it before," she said again, her tone more insistent this time, though it lacked conviction. Her unease was palpable. Holmes's gaze flickered briefly toward Lord Everleigh, who was still seated in his chair, his face unreadable. The old man's lack of response was telling. Holmes felt a slight shift in the air, a tension that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. There was more to this family's story than met the eye. "May I?" Holmes asked, gesturing toward the box. Eleanor's eyes met his, uncertainty flickering behind them. After a long pause she nodded, though her face remained pale. "Of course," she replied, her voice barely audible. Holmes took the box in his hands again, examining the craftsmanship of its design more closely. He ran his fingers over the faint engraving, his mind racing with possibilities. The scent of metal still lingered, but it was now mingled with something else, something faintly floral, as though the box had been exposed to a flower garden at some point in its history. A curious detail, but one Holmes could not yet explain. He placed it back down gently, his fingers lingering on the edges as if he had not quite finished with it. "Watson!" Holmes called, his voice sharp, his mind already moving on to the next part of the investigation. "I believe it's time we take a look at the rest of the house." Watson, who had been watching the scene unfold quietly, nodded and stood, his eyes still searching for answers in the flickering shadows of the room. "What do you think we'll find?" Watson asked as they made their way toward the door, his voice tinged with curiosity. Holmes did not immediately respond, but as they walked through the grand hallway, he spoke quietly, as though musing aloud. "There is something here, something old, something hidden, and I believe it is far more than just a misplaced candlestick." They passed by several rooms, each one holding its own mysteries, but Holmes did not stop to investigate them. His attention was firmly fixed on the stairwell ahead of them, where the shadows deepened as they ascended to the upper floors. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the distance echoed through the corridors, adding an eerie soundtrack to their movements. The upper floor of the Everleigh estate was quiet, but Holmes noted the distinct musty smell of old books that seemed to emanate from one of the rooms as they passed by. A study, perhaps. As they approached the hallway, Holmes stopped in front of a door, his hand hovering near the handle, but he did not immediately open it. "This room," Holmes said slowly, "has not been disturbed for quite some time." Eleanor, who had followed them silently up the stairs, now stepped forward. "That is my brother's room," she said softly, her voice distant. "But he hasn't been in there in days." Holmes studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp, as though assessing her every word. "Mr. Richard," he murmured. "He has been missing, has he not?" Eleanor's expression tightened and she looked away, her face flushed with discomfort. "Yes," she said quietly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But I'm sure he will return. He always does." Holmes did not speak immediately. Instead, he reached for the door, his hand closing around the cold brass handle. He opened it slowly, careful not to make a sound. The room beyond was dark, save for the faint light filtering through a set of drawn curtains. A large bed sat in the center of the room, and around it the furniture was sparse, though it appeared orderly, perhaps too much so. As they entered, Holmes's sharp eyes began to scan the room immediately, taking in the details with precision. The scent of stale air and something faintly medicinal hung in the space. It was the scent of sickness, but it was more than that. The room felt unnaturally still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Holmes moved toward the desk in the corner, his footsteps light and purposeful. He reached out, his fingers brushing over the surface, and a small piece of paper caught his attention. A single hastily scrawled note lay on the desk, its ink smudged as if it had been written in a hurry. The message was short, cryptic. "I know what you've done. Don't come after me." Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but Watson could feel the weight of the discovery settle in the room. Eleanor, standing at the threshold, gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth in shock. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What does it mean? What has happened to my brother?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded the note with deliberate care, slipping it into his pocket. He turned to face Eleanor, his eyes filled with something dark, something like the beginning of understanding. "I believe, Lady Eleanor, that the truth of your brother's disappearance, and the disappearance of the candlestick, is much closer than we realize." The day had grown darker as Holmes and Watson moved from one room to another, gathering the pieces of the puzzle with an unspoken urgency. The Everleigh estate, though beautiful and grand, seemed more like a mausoleum than a home, each hallway heavy with secrets that had been buried for far too long. Holmes was quiet, his mind shifting between thoughts as he absorbed every detail, the faint scent of must in the air, the rustle of the curtains in the breeze, the muffled sound of voices from downstairs. It was all part of the puzzle. As they entered the library, Holmes immediately gravitated towards the shelves lined with leather-bound books, their spines well worn with age. A low fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. Lady Eleanor had excused herself, and Watson had taken to perusing a set of medical journals on a nearby table. The room was now left to the three men who still remained, and it was here that Holmes planned to make his next move. Lord Everleigh sat across from Holmes, his weathered face furrowed with concern, though his eyes remained sharp. Richard Everleigh, meanwhile, had seated himself in a darkened corner, his arms crossed tightly, his eyes darting between Holmes and his father, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze for more than a fleeting moment. Holmes did not speak immediately. He studied each man with an intensity that could almost be felt in the air between them. The tension in the room was palpable, the heavy silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. Richard shifted in his seat uncomfortably, but Lord Everleigh remained motionless, his hands clasped in front of him. "I am sure you both know why I am here," Holmes began, his voice calm, precise, but carrying a weight of expectation that made the words seem more like an accusation than an inquiry. "The disappearance of the Candlestick, the odd occurrences in the house, and the distressing behavior of your son, these are not just coincidences, and they will not be ignored." Lord Everleigh's gaze tightened at the mention of his son, his jaw clenching imperceptibly. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rough, yet tinged with something else, frustration or perhaps fear. "These are just oddities. There's no mystery here." Holmes didn't take the bait, his eyes narrowing only slightly as he continued. "I beg to differ, my lord. Your son's disappearance, the erratic behavior, these are signs of something more. And the Candlestick, an object so seemingly trivial, has clearly set this chain of events into motion." Richard's eyes flickered briefly to his father, and for the first time Holmes noticed the faint glimmer of unease in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there, an awareness of something far darker than his father was willing to admit. "What exactly are you insinuating, Mr. Holmes?" Lord Everleigh asked, his tone now defensive, his posture stiffening. Holmes paused for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch before responding. "I am suggesting that your family is hiding something, perhaps something you would rather not face." He let the words hang in the air, a challenge that seemed to demand an answer, though none came immediately. Richard shifted in his seat again, his arms tightening around his chest as though he were trying to protect himself from an invisible threat. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to his father, but he said nothing. Holmes observed all of this, his mind piecing together the fragments of their behavior. "Mr. Richard," he said, turning his attention to the younger man, "you have been strangely quiet this entire time. You're the one who has been closest to these strange events, yet you've provided no insight into them." Richard stiffened, his eyes narrowing. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as though the words had been trapped somewhere deep inside him. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he replied finally, his voice low, his words carrying a hint of something, regret, perhaps, or fear. "I don't know anything about the Candlestick. I wasn't involved." Holmes tilted his head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made Richard shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Yet, you were the last person to see it, were you not?" Holmes countered. "And you disappeared for several days, only to return with no memory of where you had been." Richard's face paled, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of his unspoken truth. Lord Everleigh's voice broke through the tension. "Richard, enough," he said, his tone low but commanding. "You've said enough." Holmes didn't take his eyes off Richard. "No, my lord. It is clear that your son is hiding something. I am not here to accuse him outright, but I believe he knows more than he is letting on." Richard's shoulders sagged in resignation, and he let out a long breath, as if the weight of the conversation had become too much to bear. Slowly he stood from his seat and began pacing, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "I don't know how to explain it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I came back, and everything was wrong. The house was wrong, the people were wrong. I saw things I can't explain. And when I tried to leave, I couldn't. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive." Holmes's expression softened slightly, though his mind was already turning over the new information. "What kind of things, Mr. Richard?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. What did you see?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flickering to his father, then to the floor. "I don't know. There was a figure, a shadow, something I couldn't quite make out, and the sound, it was like whispers, soft at first, then louder. I tried to follow them, but each time I did, I found myself further away from where I thought I was." The room seemed to grow colder as Richard spoke, and Holmes could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the growing sense of danger that had permeated the house since his arrival. There was more at play here than a mere family squabble or a misplaced heirloom. "And the candlestick," Holmes pressed, "did it have anything to do with these occurrences?" Richard's eyes flickered briefly to the table where Holmes had left the box, but he quickly turned away, shaking his head. "I don't know, but I think it's all connected." Holmes rose slowly, his gaze never leaving Richard's face. "I believe you are finally beginning to see the truth," he said quietly, "and I suspect that the candlestick, and whatever is behind it, holds the key to unlocking what has been happening in this house." The air seemed to thicken as the truth, once hidden, began to emerge. The house felt different now, as though the very walls had started to close in around them. Holmes could sense the tension rising, the shadows growing longer as they delved deeper into the mystery. It was as though every room they entered, every person they questioned, only brought more questions and fewer answers. The weight of the unanswered truths hung heavy in the air. Holmes stood at the window, staring out into the mist that had thickened over the estate. The cold light of the late afternoon barely penetrated the fog, leaving the garden below shrouded in an eerie, almost unnatural stillness. Lady Eleanor had retreated for a while, perhaps to gather herself, while Lord Everleigh had retreated to his study for a private conversation with the solicitor. Richard had taken to wandering the estate's grounds, his figure barely visible against the fog that surrounded the house like a veil. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence between them, "come with me. I believe it's time we take another look at the library." Watson, who had been leafing through an old journal left on the table, looked up in mild surprise but didn't question Holmes. He followed closely as they made their way back down the hallway. The estate's quiet halls felt more oppressive now, as though every step they took carried them deeper into something unspeakable. The scent of the house, the mildew of old wood and the faintest trace of something metallic seemed to linger in the air. As they entered the library once more, Holmes made a slow, deliberate circuit of the room, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. There's something we've overlooked," he muttered to himself, his voice steady but tinged with a rare impatience. "A discrepancy in what we've been told." Watson followed Holmes' gaze as he stopped in front of the massive bookshelves. The shelves were lined with ancient tomes, many of them gathering dust in a way that suggested they had not been touched in years. Yet Holmes's attention was drawn to a set of books that looked subtly different from the rest. The spines were newer, the leather polished, and there was an odd sense of order to them that seemed out of place in a room so filled with disorder. Holmes pulled one of the books from the shelf and opened it, revealing pages filled with dense writing, though not one that Watson recognized. "These are not typical family records," Holmes said quietly, his fingers brushing over the pages. "They are financial ledgers, records of debts and transactions that seem to stretch back decades." Watson leaned in, frowning as he read over Holmes's shoulder. "What do these debts have to do with the family's current predicament?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, his brow furrowing as he flicked through more pages, each one filled with unfamiliar names and strange sums of money. As he flipped to the back of the ledger, his eyes narrowed. "It's all here, a vast network of transactions, money changing hands under dubious circumstances." "What do you mean?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with growing concern. "This doesn't seem like a simple family history." "It's not," Holmes replied, his voice colder now. "There's been more than just financial turmoil in the Everleigh family. These ledgers suggest a far more sinister motive, a conspiracy, perhaps, involving their wealth. And the candlestick. It seems to be more than just a piece of antique silver." Watson paused, his mind racing as he pieced together what Holmes was suggesting. "You think the candlestick is part of a larger scheme, Some sort of leverage? Holmes met Watson's gaze, his eyes sharp with realization. I do, but it's not just leverage. It's the key to something far darker. These transactions suggest an individual, or perhaps multiple individuals, within the Everleigh family have been involved in more than just questionable investments. I suspect someone has been using the family's history to hide something much more criminal. As he spoke, Holmes' gaze returned to the book. His fingers hovered over a particular name, one that was repeated several times in the records. It was a name that stood out amidst the sea of figures, a name that had appeared earlier in the family portraits. Thomas Everleigh, a distant relative, long thought to be dead, his existence practically erased from the family history. Thomas Everleigh, Holmes said, his voice low and deliberate. The name we missed. Watson looked up, confusion knitting his brow. But isn't Thomas Everleigh dead? He was one of the family's earlier generations. Holmes turned the page slowly, his face unreadable as he continued to read. It appears not. Thomas Everleigh was very much alive and was in fact deeply involved in these transactions. This is where the mystery begins to make sense. He was left out of the family records for a reason. Holmes' expression darkened as he turned the book toward Watson, showing the entries that listed Thomas Everleigh as an active participant in financial dealings that spanned decades. I suspect that Thomas was not just erased from the family history, but that his disappearance, his supposed death, was part of a cover-up that may have involved murder or worse. The weight of this revelation hung heavily between them, but before Watson could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, signaling the return of the others. Holmes straightened, slipping the ledger back into place with a quiet precision. We need to confront them, Holmes said, his voice steady but edged with a new urgency. The answers are closer than ever, but we must be cautious. There are lies here, lies that have been carefully constructed, lies that will unravel the moment we pull at them. Watson nodded, feeling the tension rise again. Shall we gather, everyone? Holmes hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, but first, we must speak to Richard once more. The evening had settled in, casting a long shadow over the Everleigh estate as the last traces of daylight faded into the mist. Inside the library, Holmes sat in front of the fire, his fingers steepled together in contemplation. The glow from the hearth illuminated his face, casting sharp lines and deep shadows across his features. Watson, seated beside him, could feel the quiet tension that surrounded them, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for Holmes to unravel the mystery that had ensnared the family for so long. Holmes had not spoken much since their discoveries earlier in the day. The financial ledgers, the name of Thomas Everleigh, and the strange disappearances had all led him down a path of realization. Yet, despite his usual confidence, he appeared to be deep in thought, carefully weighing every detail in his mind before making the next move. Watson, unable to remain silent for much longer, broke the stillness. Holmes, he said quietly, leaning forward, his voice laced with curiosity. What do you make of it all? The ledgers, the candlestick, Richard's disappearance. It all seems to point to something far larger than we first imagined. Holmes turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with Watson's. There was a glint of something in his gaze, an unspoken understanding, perhaps even a satisfaction at having uncovered the first threads of the larger picture. It is a tangled web, Holmes said, his voice quiet but measured. But as with all webs, there is a core, a central thread that ties everything together. I believe we are dealing with a conspiracy, a well-constructed lie that has been carefully hidden beneath layers of family history and deceit. He paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to the ledger resting on the table in front of them. The candlestick, the disappearance of Thomas Everleigh, the strange behavior of Richard. It all points to one thing. Someone in this house has been trying to keep the truth hidden for years. Watson furrowed his brow. But what is the truth, Holmes? What could be so terrible that they would go to such lengths to conceal it? Holmes leaned forward, his fingers brushing over the edges of the ledger. "It is not just one secret, Watson. It is a series of events carefully orchestrated over decades to ensure that the Everleigh family's true history remains buried. The candlestick is not an innocent object. It is a symbol of something far darker, something tied to Thomas Everleigh's disappearance and the manipulation of wealth within this family." Watson looked at Holmes, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the information. "You think the candlestick holds the key to all of this? But how does it connect to Thomas Everleigh's disappearance?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood and moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the fog that now enveloped the estate. The rain had picked up again, drumming softly against the window pane, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the thoughts tumbling in his mind. "The candlestick was a marker," Holmes said at last, his voice low and filled with quiet certainty. "A symbol used by Thomas Everleigh to communicate something, a secret message that would have been understood only by those involved. Whoever moved it first knew the significance of that action and likely intended to send a signal to someone else." Watson leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of Holmes's words. But why now? Why would they make a move after all these years? "Because," Holmes continued, turning to face Watson, "the time was right. Richard's return, his disappearance, the pressure on Lord Everleigh, it all created the perfect storm. The family's foundation is crumbling, and those involved in these transactions cannot afford to let their secrets come to light." Holmes paused, his expression shifting as if a new thought had struck him. "But I believe there is something else at play here, something far more personal. The Everleigh family's fortune is not just built on financial dealings. It is built on manipulation, betrayal, and a need to maintain control at all costs." Watson looked up at him, intrigued yet perplexed. "You mean they're not just after money, but power?" Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he considered the final pieces of the puzzle. "Exactly. And Richard, though unwilling to admit it, has been caught in the crossfire of a power struggle that dates back generations. He is not just the victim of his family's secrecy. He is a pawn in a much larger game." There was a moment of silence between them as the weight of Holmes's words settled in. The mystery, once a simple matter of a missing candlestick, had now transformed into a complex web of greed, manipulation, and hidden truths. "I believe," Holmes said, his voice sharp with finality, "that we are close, Watson. The next step is to confront the Everleighs with what we know, and with what they've been hiding for so long." But as Holmes spoke, Watson could sense the subtle shift in his demeanor. Holmes, ever the master of deduction, had already formulated his next move. But there was something in the way he held himself, an awareness that the final confrontation would not be as simple as exposing the truth. There were dangers here, dangers that were yet to be revealed. "Are we ready for that?" Watson asked, his voice thick with concern. "To confront them? They'll not take kindly to the truth being laid bare." Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Truth, Watson, is a curious thing. It is both liberating and destructive, but it is always necessary. And as for readiness," he paused, his gaze hardening, "we must be, because once the truth is exposed, there is no going back." The evening had reached its peak, and the air in the Everleigh estate had grown thick with anticipation. The shadows of the grand hall stretched long, the gas lamps flickering dimly, casting an uneven glow that only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Holmes, Watson, and the rest of the Everleigh family had gathered in the drawing room, an uneasy silence hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Holmes stood by the large fireplace, his back to the hearth, his fingers lightly tapping against his chin as he regarded each of the family members. Lady Eleanor sat near the window, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously from one person to another. Lord Everleigh remained in his high-backed chair by the fire, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Richard stood apart from them all, his gaze distant, his hands clenched at his sides as though he were preparing for something he could not escape. Holmes finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the stillness. "It is time that you know the truth, all of you. The secrets that have been buried within these walls, the lies that have kept this family's history hidden, these are the things that have brought us here." The tension in the room seemed to multiply, the very air crackling with an unspoken dread. Richard flinched at Holmes' words, but it was Eleanor's face that betrayed the most. Her lips trembled, and her hands tightened around the fabric of her dress. Holmes took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the family members seated before him. "Lady Eleanor, Lord Everleigh, Richard, you are all caught in a web of your own making, and it is time to cut through the strands and reveal the truth." He turned toward Richard, who was standing by the far wall, looking as though he might bolt at any moment. "Mr. Richard Everleigh," Holmes began, his tone soft yet laden with gravity, "you have been the unwitting key to this mystery. It is not just the Candlestick or the missing Thomas Everleigh that has caused your family's downfall. It is your very bloodline, your connection to secrets buried deep within this house." Richard's face twisted in confusion, but he did not speak. His jaw tightened, and Holmes could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle between denial and realization. Holmes continued, his voice now more commanding. "The Candlestick, though seemingly innocuous, is a symbol, one that has marked this family for generations. It was once a sign of power, a reminder of who truly controlled the Everleigh fortune. It was Thomas Everleigh who understood its significance, and it was Thomas Everleigh who, in his dying moments, passed that knowledge on to those who would use it to their advantage." There was a sharp intake of breath from Eleanor, and Lord Everleigh's fingers twitched slightly, a hint of discomfort beneath his otherwise composed exterior. Holmes could sense their panic now, even if they tried to hide it. "You see," Holmes continued, his voice rising ever so slightly, "Thomas Everleigh did not die by accident. He was murdered, killed by someone who knew the power he held, the power of the family's hidden wealth and the influence he could have exerted. But in his final moments, Thomas made sure his knowledge did not die with him. The Candlestick was the key. The moment it was moved, it triggered a chain of events that set everything in motion. Richard, your disappearance was no accident. You were being used." Richard's eyes widened in disbelief, and he stumbled slightly, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "What do you mean?" I don't understand." Holmes turned to face Lord Everleigh, his voice hardening. "And you, my lord, are no innocent. The debts in the ledgers, the manipulation of your family's wealth, it was you who took advantage of Thomas' death. You erased him from the family records, but not because he was dead, no. You erased him because his knowledge threatened everything you had worked to build. You couldn't let his legacy, his control, remain intact." Lord Everleigh remained silent, but his face was a mask of anger and fear, his lips pressed tightly together as though he were trying to contain a storm within him. He rose from his chair slowly, his voice strained as he spoke. "You don't know what you're talking about, Holmes," he growled. "Thomas was a madman. He was obsessed with the family's wealth, obsessed with power. He was dangerous, and I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect what was rightfully mine." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You killed him and you covered it up. But that's not enough, is it? You've kept this family locked in a prison of lies, using them as pawns in your game for power. Richard, Eleanor, your lives, your futures have all been manipulated by your own father." Eleanor stood suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "Father, you killed him?" Lord Everleigh turned to her, his expression one of cold defiance. "He was a threat, Eleanor, a threat to everything I've worked for. Do you think I would have let him destroy our family's future?" Holmes watched the exchange, his eyes narrowed with understanding. "And Richard? You were the pawn, used to cover up the crime, to keep the secrets from ever coming to light. But the Candlestick moved, and it all came crashing down." Richard's breath caught in his throat, his gaze shifting from Holmes to his father. "No, I didn't know. I never knew." Holmes stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "The truth is a powerful thing, Mr. Everleigh, and now that it has been uncovered, there is no turning back. The web you have woven is unraveling, and it will be your downfall, just as it was Thomas." Lord Everleigh stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. The silence in the room was deafening as the weight of the revelation settled over them all. Then, with a swift motion, Holmes turned to Watson, signaling the end of this chapter. "We've done all we can here. It's time to bring this to an end." The final confrontation had left the family in turmoil, the air in the drawing-room thick with a mixture of guilt, anger, and disbelief. Holmes stood by the window, his back to the room, looking out into the darkening landscape beyond. The Everleigh estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, now seemed like a prison, its once grand walls closing in on those who had concealed the darkest of secrets for so long. Watson stood near the door, watching the family members, each one reeling from the revelations. Lady Eleanor sat quietly by the fire, her face pale, her eyes staring vacantly ahead. Lord Everleigh had been escorted from the room under guard, his hands bound, his pride shattered. Richard, still standing at the centre of the room, seemed lost in the weight of everything that had been exposed, the history of his family unravelling before his eyes. "Holmes," Watson finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a note of concern. "What now?" Holmes didn't turn to face Watson, but his eyes remained fixed on the fog that blanketed the estate. "Now we wait," he said softly. "The authorities will take it from here. Lord Everleigh will be tried for his crimes, and the truth of Thomas Everleigh's death will finally be revealed to the world. As for the family, they will have to rebuild, but at least now they can do so with the knowledge that the truth has come to light." Watson nodded, though he still seemed troubled. "But what about Eleanor and Richard? Where do they go from here? They've been caught in the crossfire of all this." Holmes' expression softened, but only for a moment. "They will have to live with the consequences of their family's actions, but they are not the ones to blame for what their father did. There is still time for them to forge their own paths, separate from the legacy that has bound them to their father's deceit." Richard, who had been silently standing by the window, spoke up, his voice shaky but gaining strength with each word. I didn't know, Mr. Holmes. I didn't know any of this. What my father had done, what he was capable of. I only knew that I wanted to escape, to get away from it all. But now I realize I can't run anymore." Holmes turned to face him, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "You cannot change the past, Richard, but you can choose how to move forward. You are not defined by your father's actions. What you do from this point onward is up to you." Richard swallowed hard, nodding slowly. His eyes were red from the weight of everything that had happened, but there was a glimmer of something else in them now, something that had been absent before. Determination. Eleanor, who had been silent for much of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to be part of something so dark. But I understand now that I've been living in the shadow of my father's sins for far too long. I'm ready to face the truth, no matter what it costs." Holmes regarded her for a moment before nodding, his expression unreadable. "The truth, Eleanor, is always the hardest thing to accept, but it is the only thing that will set you free. The past is a heavy burden, but you have a chance to rebuild, to live your life on your own terms." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but heavy with reflection. The family had been fractured, their future uncertain, but at least now they could begin the long process of healing. As the evening wore on, the sound of distant sirens echoed through the mists, signalling the arrival of the authorities. Holmes, Watson, Eleanor, and Richard stood together in the room, each of them marked by the events of the day. The air was thick with the weight of it all, but there was a sense of closure now, a sense that the truth, however painful, had finally been revealed. "Come, Watson," Holmes said after a long pause, his voice once again calm and collected. We have done all we can here. There is nothing more to uncover in this house. The case is closed." Watson hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on the Everleigh family, before he turned to follow Holmes to the door. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, the fog swallowing them as they made their way down the steps and into the carriage waiting for them. Holmes settled into the seat, his gaze distant as the carriage began its journey back to London. Watson sat beside him, his mind still processing the events of the day. "Do you think they'll ever truly recover from this, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice softer now. Holmes's eyes narrowed, the flickering light from the street lamps outside casting shadows across his face. "Recovery, Watson, is a long road, but as long as they seek the truth, they will have the chance to rebuild. The rest is up to them." The carriage rumbled on, the sound of its wheels blending with the distant murmur of the city. For now the case was over, but the memory of the Everleigh family and the dark secrets they had kept hidden for so long would linger in Holmes' mind for some time to come.